Okay, well, good evening. Welcome to University of York's 2024 Open Lectures. I'm Tim Doran from the Department of Health Sciences here at York, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event. This lecture is part of the York Disability Week, which is a week-long programme of events taking place within Disability History Month and supported by York Human Rights City Network. It also coincides with the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which was on the 3rd of December. Okay, so we're very fortunate this evening to have the very brilliant Jane Draycott with us, who's a lecturer in ancient history at the University of Glasgow. Her research investigates science, technology, and medicine in the ancient world. Jane's published exclusively on the history and archaeology of medicine, on impairment and disability in the ancient world. So some of her greatest hits include Roman domestic medical practice in central Italy, from the Middle Republic to the early Empire, approaches to healing in Roman Egypt, and volumes on prostheses in antiquity and bodies of evidence, ancient anatomical voted past, present and future. So really happy to be talking to Jane tonight. She's clearly the right person for this topic. And we were talking about her research on the long history of prosthetics and assistive technology in classical antiquity. And Jane will be sharing findings from literary, documentary, archaeological, bioarchaeological evidence, and giving us a picture of their importance for the experiences of people with disabilities in classical antiquity. So as I say, love to hear your questions. So if you do just want to post them as we go along in the Q&A session, or you might want to just sort of listen to the talk and post them at the end. So we'll hopefully have sort of 15, 20 minutes at the end for us to put your questions. So Jane, good evening.
Hello.
Yeah, so before we get started on the research, just a little bit about you. So we know you work at the University of Glasgow, but what is it that you sort of do day to day, and what got you interested in it in the first place?
I'm a lecturer in the classics subject area at the University of Glasgow, and this is my 9th year, I think, in that institution. I started off as a postdoctoral fellow, and then I was into a lectureship. And I could potentially be at the University of Glasgow until I retire, if I ever retire, because academic jobs do not come along very often. So it's quite an interesting position to be in, to think that you could be in the job that you're going to do for the rest of your life, in the institution you're going to do it in for the rest of your life. And there are certainly I can't think of many other places actually that I would rather work. I mean, the University of Glasgow it's a been given a lot of support to do my research and everything else that I have to do as part of my job. So I research, but I also teach, and that is also something that I very much enjoy. We just finished teaching for this semester this week, so next comes the marking. I think I've always been interested in history, and I've always been interested in archaeology, and so when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my career, it was going to be something either to do with literature or with history. And when I was a teenager, there was this program on BBC Two called Meet the Ancestors, and some people may remember it. I think for a while it was on iPlayer again, not too long ago. But the premise of this program, I guess it was broadcast during the 90s, mid to late 90s. And every episode, they would focus on a set of human remains, a skeleton, usually that had been found somewhere in Britain from the Roman period, the Anglo-Saxon period, the medieval period, something like that. So someone's human remains. And those would be analysed. There would be a facial reconstruction. Their grave goods would be analysed. And the point of each episode was to create as full a picture of this person's life as possible. And that really captured my imagination. I thought, that is what I want to do. I didn't realize at the time that it's not really one person that does that. It's a whole team of people, because of course the way that it was presented on TV is a lot of people working behind the scenes to have something that the presenter presents. But that was what got me interested in using archaeology and bioarchaeology and as well as literature to find out information about the people of the past. You know, not just the important people, the kings and the queens and the members of the elite, but ordinary people who otherwise we wouldn't know anything about. And so that's what I've been really doing for the last decade or so as an academic, is really trying to indulge my inherent nosiness and find out as much about people as possible.
And for those who don't know, so you mentioned archaeology and bioarchaeology. So how are those two different? And is it are these sort of two different schools? You either go in one direction or the other, or can you be both an archaeologist and a bioarchaeologist?
Well, I suppose anyone who works in any kind of archaeology could call themselves an archaeologist, or someone could call them an archaeologist, because it's all archaeology. It's all looking at the material remains of the past. But I suppose what you do, what specific type of remains you look at, you can then sort of use a more specific title. So a bioarchaeologist will be someone who looks at human remains rather than buildings or inscriptions or art or other things like that.
Okay. So just sort of moving on onto your research. So we've got the title of Ancient Greece and Rome, and we often talk about antiquity. So what sort of period are we talking about? Which sort of when do you start being interested, and when do you stop being interested?
Well, in my professional life, I am primarily a Roman historian and archaeologist, and that's pretty much the late Republic through into the early imperial period. So you could call that the sort of central period of Roman history, which is sort of about 100 BCE through to 100 CE. That's a sweet spot for me. But of course, when you're trying to look at sort of broader topics like health and like medicine and like, you can't be so specific, because the evidence that you have is so spread out, and you have to take in as much as you possibly can. So in a classics department, you will normally be talking about the sort of archaic Greek period, where we first start to see things like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And that is sort of the starting period, although for some people they might go back a bit further to the Mycenaeans, the Minoans. And then you will generally stop in the sort of late antique period, although again, some departments might go through into the Byzantine period. Mine at Glasgow is sort of archaic Greece, classical Greece, through to late antiquity. So that's a period of about 1,000 years. I don't really cover that much. I'm sort of a bit narrower in my focus. But at the same time, when you look at something like disability, it's quite helpful to bring in later examples, because you can see whether there are sort of common themes across centuries, across millennia, in the way that people behave to each other. And sometimes there are. And you can say, all right, okay, I can see that this is, that there is a lot about ancient disability that is very similar, for example, to the early 20th century, and the way that disability was treated in the wake of the First and Second World War. So you can see, in the ancient societies that I deal with that are quite militaristic societies, there is a lot of stuff in common with the First World War and the Second World War. But at the same time, there are some things that are completely different. So it's interesting to sort of cast your net wide and look at it that way.
Yeah. So with your more sort of, your narrower focus, this sort of 100 years either side of zero, what is it that makes this period so fascinating generally, and for this particular topic, other than the fact that there was a lot of fighting going on, and often, when we're talking about Rome fighting with themselves? Is that part of the attraction? But what else was going on sort of socially and culturally that makes this such a fascinating period?
Well, for me, the Roman period is the point where we start to see a huge amount of evidence for ordinary people. So we have the literary evidence, the ancient books, for want of a better word, the poetry, the prose, the fiction, the non-fiction written by the ancient Roman elite, just as we have literary evidence for ancient Greece as well. And so we have those for various different societies. And they're they're great. They're very useful for all manner of things, particularly things like politics and warfare and mythology and religion. But they're not so great at telling you about ordinary people because they tend to focus on the elite who are in a position to be making decisions and doing the politics, doing the warfare. And so the Roman period is where we start to see ordinary people, and we see them in what we call the epigraphic habit, which is inscriptions. So inscriptions, they existed prior to the Roman period, absolutely, but there's this explosion of documentation basically in the Roman period. Ordinary people putting up inscriptions that tell us about themselves and their lives, even the very sort of most basic facts, but they do give us information. We start to see ordinary people's literacy, so in things like papyri and ostraca from Egypt, in tablets from Britain, Vindolanda. So we get to read people's letters, we get to access to their sort of innermost private relationships. We get census returns, we get their petitions, we get shopping lists, so we start to see that kind of thing, and we see a huge amount of material culture as well, ordinary people's possessions. And so for something like disability, that can be really useful because we can see a demographic who are not normally featured heavily in the ancient literary evidence, or if they are featured in the literary evidence, it's in very specific ways. So to be able to access them without that sort of that ideological filter is quite interesting and quite worthwhile, I think.
Okay, and then I mean, so we it required a sort of explosion in literacy, and for people below the top of the hierarchy to become literate, but I guess they also need to be writing down on a medium which is going to survive, right? So when you're talking about the sort of the evidence that you're using, what sort of written forms are we talking about? What survived long enough for us to now be able to examine it?
So it is very, very variable depending on where you're looking at. So in Egypt, for example, because Egypt has got a very hot, dry climate, lots of papyri, so texts written on papyrus, which is basically the ancient version of paper. They survive in rubbish dumps. People threw away their papyri when they didn't need them anymore, and they got covered in sand and they got preserved. And so 2,000 years later, archaeologists come along, they excavate them, or they find them in mummy wrappings and cartonnage and things like that. So the documents come to light, and then they can be read and translated and disseminated that way. For things like the tablets at Vindolanda, same sort of thing, only in that case, it's not a hot, dry context, it's a cold, wet one. We're all familiar with the British weather. So similar things, you excavate, you find these deposits of material, again, things thrown away when the people living in the forts on Hadrian's Wall, when they left, they left their rubbish behind, and 2,000 years later, archaeologists can come along and find it, and it's a lot more precious to us than it was to them.
So basically, you're rooting through people's bins, right? This is
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
We are dumpster divers. We have no shame. We are the equivalent of like the gutter press, trying to find out people's innermost secrets.
yeah, and thinking about the sort of forms of data you're using for this, so you've got your sort of written materials, your documentary evidence, but you also have the prosthetics themselves, right? So some prosthetics will be in a form that is preserved, and presumably you're finding that sometimes in graves, sometimes in other locations. But are you also looking at bones? So can you see evidence of prosthetics preserved in the skeletal data?
Prosthetics is one of those topics where it is really helpful to bring archaeology and bioarchaeology into it, because while we have lots of references to prosthetics in ancient literature, these are very sort of quick, just throwaway observations that such and such a person had such and such a prosthetic. So they don't give us any descriptions. They don't give us instructions on how to make one. They don't give us anybody's personal experience of using them. And so we know they exist. We know people are using them. We know a little something about what people think of them, people who are not the people using them, I should add. But when it comes to the actual prosthetics themselves, yes, we have to look at the archaeological record, and we've got some really fantastic examples. Not many, unfortunately, and they're quite widely spread out across space and time. But yes, we can look at the actual prosthetics themselves, and we can look at the human remains of the people who used them. So sometimes you will find the human remains on their own. So you will see that somebody has had an amputation. They have had an amputated hand or arm. You can see that their amputation took place during their lifetime rather than after their death. Been some healing on the end of the bone, and you can tell from that whether it was a very recent amputation and that they had probably died as a result of it, as a result of some kind of infection or something, or if it was an amputation that was done years ago and they've lived with it. And sometimes when you find people who have had amputations, you find the prosthetic with them strapped onto their body in some capacity. And I do actually have some images that I can share of some examples of these, and there'll be really, really good examples of how variable the prosthetics are, even when it comes to the same type of prosthetic. Two people, same amputation, very different prosthetics. So there are two examples of prosthetic toes from Egypt. They are not too far apart as far as dates are concerned, but they are taken in a very sort of different direction. And so we have, one of them is a piece of cartonnage that has been shaped to look like a toe, and you would basically slot it onto the top of your foot. And the other one is a series of plates that would be laced together around your foot. And those were both worn by people during life. We can tell because they have wear on the bottom. So they might have been worn barefoot, they might have been worn with sandals, but people wore them while they were going about their business. And they would have had these specially made for them. You don't go to a prosthetic shop in antiquity, as far as we can tell. There isn't enough business in that line of work, but you can commission a carpenter, a leather worker, a metal worker, something special for you.
So we've got this, when we're talking about prosthetics and assistance devices, so obviously we've seen the example of a sort of replacement big toe, but what were the sort of range of things? So when we're talking about, what was it, you talked about amputations, you've talked about losing a limb or losing part of a limb, but what sort of uses were they finding in the ancient world which would require a prosthetic or require some form of assistance device?
Really interesting question, because as I said, the literary evidence is not entirely helpful in that respect. We know people have certain types of devices, we know they use them, but the question of how functional they are is it's open to interpretation. So the two prosthetic toes that are on the screen at the moment, they were both functional. You can manage without your big toe, you can walk without it. So it's not that these people couldn't walk and the prosthetics helped them walk, but it would have made it easier. Experimental archaeology has been done on these objects. Recreations have been made, and they have been worn by people who have the same amputation. And those people have said these are very comfortable. These are good for sort of walking around, probably improve your balance a little bit. But then you have other things. The example on the screen at the moment, this is a man who lost his hand at some point early in his life and replaced it with a knife. So I suppose we could call this a prosthetic hand, a weaponized prosthetic hand. And we have a reference in ancient literature to a man who, when he lost his right hand, he he replaced it with an iron hand that he used to hold his shield, and he proceeded to use his left hand to wield his sword instead. So we've got individuals here who are weaponizing and using these things in a very functional way. You have a knife, you use it for food, you use it for protection, you use it for all sorts of things like cutting, and you can probably be quite dexterous with it too. And we also have a lot of legs, peg legs, and more sort of elaborate examples of legs as well. So this is a replica, the original version of this that was destroyed in the Blitz, unfortunately. But the original prosthetic leg would have been wooden. It would have been attached to the body with leather straps, and this is a sort of would have been a metal casing over the wood to make it sort of look quite impressive. And this person would have been able to walk short distances using a crutch or a stick of some kind. So this is not a great prosthetic for your ability to move around and move around quickly, but it looks cool. It's designed to be eye-catching. So that is another function that we should perhaps consider as well. We have sort of utility, yes, in the sense of doing practical logistical things, but we also have the way that things look and the impression that they give to other people. And so I will see if I can get to some other examples. This one, for example, this is your sort of your straightforward peg leg, remains your straightforward peg leg, found in a grave to the person who used it. But we also have examples of dental appliances. So false teeth, golden bands that would be worn around teeth. And these are not so functional in the way that dentures are today. So these might help improve your speech a little bit, but they're not sort of so as good for your speech or for your ability to speak as dental appliances are. What these are very eye-catching, and they're indicative of quite high status. And so these are sort of on the same level as jewelry. And we also have prosthetic hair, and both wigs and hair pieces that would have been worn both to supplement existing hair or to replace hair that you lost, whether through some kind of health issue or some kind of pregnancy. You can lose hair through menopause, you can lose hair through illness, but also in antiquity, heads were shaved as a sort of part of medical practice. So if you had a serious illness, the doctor would shave your head, and then they would apply all sorts of medicines to your head. And so it would be a long time before your hair grew back. So you would wear something like this. And they are functional in the sense that you can style them. So the example on the right, which is actually in York, so I would encourage everybody to go and see this in your museum. But you can see it's got jet pins put through it to style it. And then the example on the left, this would have been a crest worn at the front of the head to create a hairstyle known as the orbis. And you can see the pins that come with that as well. So these are being used, they are being changed in their appearance. So they have function there. And so we perhaps should think about the difference between something's form and something's function, and whether something has a function in the sense of being actively used or being seen in a certain way by the people that would be looking at you and interacting with you.
Yeah. So there's clearly sort of practical functions to this, but also an aesthetic quality. So there was no real need with the toe to carve a toenail in there, right? That's not going to actually help with function. So do you think this was to make it give it more of an appearance of the natural toe, or do you think this was just more a sort of stylistic device?
That is also an interesting question, because what we can tell from the literature is that the very niche demographic of people that were writing the ancient literature, so the elite generally men, generally rather sort of wealthy, important citizens. They had very, very set ideas about everything, about how everyone should behave. They had ideas should behave, how women should behave, how people who were lower down the social hierarchy should behave. And they are very against any advice that is pretending to be the real body part. So they are particularly against false teeth and false hair, because this is tapping into a scene of misogyny, where women, older women, ugly women, unhealthy women can present a more appealing appearance. They can make themselves look young, they can make themselves look beautiful. And if they do this, if they use the false teeth and the false hair to appear young and beautiful, then they might basically force a poor, unsuspecting man to have sex with them, and under the impression that they're young and they're beautiful and they're desirable. And so this is something that ancient men worry about quite a lot, being tricked into some sort of sexual or romantic relationship with a woman who's actually old enough to be their grandmother, or has designs on their fortune or something. And so this is actually a bit more broadly applicable as well. If people are pretending that their false hand or their false foot is real, then they are being deceitful, they are being dishonest, and there is something fundamentally wrong with that. Whereas if you have your prosthetic hand or your prosthetic leg or your prosthetic foot, and it's very clearly a prosthetic device, that's fine. And in fact, that's quite interesting. You can communicate all sorts of messages to other people about your wealth, your sophistication, your creativity with your blatantly false object. Whereas if you were trying to pretend that that was really your hand or really your foot, and you actually fooled people into thinking that that was true, then that is very bad. And this is quite interesting, because this is a very fundamental difference between ancient prosthetics and more recent ones. So earlier on, I mentioned the First World War, the Second World War, and when in the men came back from those wars, and from the American Civil War as well, there were huge numbers of amputees, and they needed prosthetic devices, both to allow them to pass in everyday society without people sort of looking at them, staring at them, reacting to them in a negative way, to in a way sort of allow everybody to forget what had happened by not having to confront the damaged bodies of a generation of men who'd gone off and fought in these wars, but also to allow them to be what men in their societies needed to be, which was breadwinners, earners. And so prosthetic devices that were designed in the late 19th and early 20th century, a big part of that is how realistic they look and how you can pass and nobody will notice. And it's only really in the last sort of few years that prosthetic devices have gone in a completely different direction, and people actually want to stand out. There is a wonderful company called the Alternative Limb Project. They make bespoke prosthetic devices for people. And while they do make realistic, naturalistic ones, they also make incredibly artistic ones based entirely on what the client wants. So we have people who have wanted an arm designed like a video game character. We have people who have wanted arms that look like vines or look like snakes. And they do this deliberately because they want to have something very beautiful and unique and creative that people will notice. And I guess to be that, if you're this kind of person, you're quite extroverted, you're quite, you're probably quite interested in things like, fashion, and you have a very very specific individualized look in your clothes and your hair and your general approach to work. And so this is an extension of that. This is how you can make everyone notice. So there are a couple here, and there are the testimonials of the people who commissioned them as well. And I think those are really interesting to get this kind of insight into this process. And so the one on the right, you think, well, yes, it's a tattoo, but then you look a bit closer and you see, well, actually, there's a whole lot more to it than tattooing. Whereas the one on the left, that is what your leg actually looks like, or at least in a version of what your leg looks like under the skin. And so when you've got people walking around with these sorts of prosthetics, that is a conversation starter. These are the kind of things there is in the National Museum of Scotland, Edinburgh. One of these has been donated to the Museum of Display, and so you can sort of see it both as a, yes, it was originally designed to be someone's prosthetic arm, but it is now it's a museum exhibition. It's a work of art. It's got all sorts of different ways that you can look at it.
So there are some similarities between, where we are now and where they were perhaps in this ancient Roman period, in that deception was frowned upon, but ostentation was not. So you could, as long as you weren't trying to be deceptive, it was okay to celebrate. And so was there a sort of a budget prosthetic market and a more upmarket prosthetic market? So in the budget end, it might be something which is a little bit more rough and ready, that perhaps a local carpenter had put together to sort of help you with your daily activities, and then a sort of more upmarket one where you might get jewelers involved, you might get metalsmiths involved, something that would be signaling your status.
Absolutely. As with any society, what is available to the rich and what is available to the poor is not the same. And so for the very poor people, what we tend to hear about when we get descriptions of beggars is that they are either using a stick to help them walk, or they are pairing up with another beggar. So there is this sort of popular little I guess you'd call it a fable, of a blind beggar who is able-bodied and a sighted beggar who is paralyzed. And so the blind beggar carries the physically impaired, paralyzed beggar on his back, and they sort of combine their bodies and the things that they do have to compensate for the things that they don't. And so for the very poorest people, they wouldn't be able to have any sort of worthwhile prosthetic device. I mean, to be fair, they may not have wanted them. Not everybody necessarily wants, even today, not every amputee wants to use a prosthetic device. And the people who are born without arms or without legs, a couple of the alternative limb project people actually, they have said, when they were born without an arm, they never actually liked wearing a prosthetic arm because it just always felt strange. Whereas getting an alternative limb that was a sort of a statement, that was the first time they really enjoyed wearing a prosthetic arm. So in antiquity, a lot of people probably didn't use prosthetics because they were not readily available. So we do hear a lot about wood, and obviously wood is far more accessible to people than gold or silver. You can find wood in lots of different places. Olive wood tends to be in antiquity the most accessible wood because there are olive trees in the Mediterranean pretty much everywhere. That's the wood that tends to get used for tools and things like that. So that's the wood that some people are using for their sort of quite basic prosthetic devices. There's leather, obviously. That's quite useful for things like the cuffs that you would fit over the end of a wooden leg, so it's more comfortable to wear. But you could also have a leather hand or a leather arm, or something like that. And then, yes, the wealthy people, they are the ones that use the very complex, multi-material, artsy, beautifully produced prosthetic devices. You know, they can hire an ivory carver, a gold worker, you know, and get all of those very luxurious materials rather than just wood or leather.
Is there any sort of sense of how effective a lot of these prosthetics were? I mean, my assumption is that, you know, as we progress 2,000 years, that the sort of prosthetics we have now are just much more functional, much more comfortable, much more effective at doing their intended purpose. So do we know anything about how effective these prosthetics were, and how elaborate they could be?
Well, if we think back to the example of the man with the knife hand that I showed earlier, now the reason that we know that he had been using that knife hand, knife prosthesis for a long time is because there was wear on his teeth where he had been tightening putting the prosthetic on and off and then tightening the strap. So he was sort of getting it with his teeth and sort of pulling it to tighten it up. And he'd been doing that over many years. So presumably that was comfortable for him, because if it wasn't, he wouldn't have done that for so long. And so we can if we have that sort of evidence, we can make the assumption from that. And I think when you find the human remains with the prosthetic devices in the graves, and the prosthetic devices are strapped to the people in question, and they've got wear on them like the Egyptian toes or like the knife hand. I mean, I think it's safe to say that yes, they were comfortable, they were useful, and people had a reason to wear them. Because we don't get disabled people, amputees, their own personal accounts of using their prosthetics, we don't necessarily know what their experiences were, but it's just something that we sort of have to do the best with the evidence that we have. And it's also something that you can talk to contemporary amputees. I mean, I've been to a hospital to talk to the prosthetist who makes various different prosthetics for people, and told me all about his career and his experiences making them, and the patients that he had worked with. So if you can't find the specific evidence you want in the historical or archaeological record, you can attempt to use comparative evidence and put those things together again, and then get a sense of, well, if someone's experience today is this, is that something that's relevant to the people in the past? You know, are there aspects of it that are relevant to them? They obviously didn't have the NHS, they didn't have, you know, the kinds of technical advancements that we see today, but they did have people who could make versions of these objects for them, and who would presumably work with them over an extended period of time to make sure that it did in fact fit, and it was in fact fit for purpose, because otherwise you're not going to pay for it, are you? If you've got the money to commission this thing in the first place, if you're not happy with it, how often do sort of wealthy entitled people accept things that they're happy with? You know, very, very seldom.
So do you think there's any sort of social or psychological significance to the fact that you are finding these prosthetics in the graves, right? I presume the reason that you would bury an item with a person is that it had some special significance for that person, and maybe didn't have any use to somebody else in the family who could use it. But also it seems that they're sometimes buried attached to the person, as if it's part of the person. So is there any significance in that at all?
Yes, I think so. All the ones that I'm aware of, they weren't just buried with the person as a grave good, they were actually attached to their body. So the way that I interpret that is that if their family wanted to reuse the materials, you know, melt down the gold or the bronze or the copper, or repurpose the wood or the leather or whatever else, because that is quite often what you find in antiquity. You know, the reason we don't have more precious metal surviving is because it was precious, and people didn't want to dispose of it forever. They wanted to reuse it. So the reason that we have these objects in the first place is because they were seen as part of that person's body, and they were seen as a fundamental part of that person and their identity, and something that they would take with them into the afterlife, whatever version of the afterlife you happened to believe in at that point in time.
Interesting. So we've had some questions come in, so I'm going to start moving over to our audience now. So we have a question on the sort of similarities, if there are similarities and differences between what you're finding in the Roman period and in the more modern period, particularly talking about, periods of war. So in terms of how the impairments are perceived, for example, and the sorts of prosthetics that you would get used under those circumstances.
So as far as prosthetics are concerned, these would be the most we see and hear about this. I think have the most sort of archaeological and historical examples of these. There were not really any technological advancements in prosthetic legs until the sort of mid to late 20th century. So for sort of several thousand years, people were using peg legs, and then sort of, eventually they had a slightly articulated knee, but then there wasn't really any sort of significant technological advancement. So your experience using a prosthetic leg as a Roman was much the same as your experience using a prosthetic leg in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. And I think there are a lot of the same attitudes displayed. So we see in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, for example, on the one hand, these are very militaristic societies where large numbers of men served in the army, whether part-time or full-time. And so on the one hand, war wounds were good. You know, you were brave. You had fought on behalf of your kingdom or state or your lord or whatever. And so, good for you for doing this. On the other hand, you would have people point at you in the street and laugh and make fun of you. And so there was tension between lionizing veterans and mock them. And this is something that is although we see this throughout history, really. There is the sort of the high level praise of the idea of the individual who sacrifices their bodily integrity for their country. And then there is the reality of their day-to-day life where they can't get a job, and they can't get a partner, and they have to deal with all the sort of the small and not so small indignities of having to go through daily life in a world that is not designed for them and is not particularly sympathetic or empathetic to them either. And so that is something that is quite interesting to me. When I started researching disability in antiquity, you see exactly the same kinds of situations. You see people attempt to claim disability benefit and being tested to see just how disabled they are. So this is something that happens in classical Athens. There is a disability pension, but you have to be disabled enough to warrant getting it. And you have disability hate crime. So there is an example from Roman Egypt of a man who wrote a series of petitions to his, essentially the ancient equivalent of his MP, complaining that people in his village were trying to victimize him, and they were breaking into his house, and they were stealing his property, and they were menacing himself and his elderly mother. And he wanted something done about this because this was not okay. And so, yeah, you see the sorts of things that you read in the newspapers today.
So some things don't change. Some things I guess will also depend on how a particular culture feels about warfare generally, and perhaps about a particular conflict. So sort of thinking when my granddad lost his leg in the First World War to a bullet, and my sense was that he often wore his prosthetic leg as much for other people as he did for himself. So it was, you know, so as not to appear as a burden or not to remind them or and so on. So it was a case of making other people feel comfortable around him, because they would, if he's wearing trousers, they would obviously comment if he only had half a leg. They would not comment if there was a wooden leg under there, because they really couldn't tell. So I guess people's perceptions will change over time. I've got another question, and I think I know who this is from. Are there any ancient written records alluding to the phantom limb phenomenon?
Not that I'm aware of, because we do get lots of accounts of people losing their limbs, and there are some very sort of grisly military examples of people losing their right hand, because that's the hand that you hold your sword with, that's the hand that you hold out in front of you, and you know, and we hear about people losing their hand and then looking as their hand, you know, moves around and twitches and things like that. But because we don't have the perspectives of disabled people by and large, I mean, there are some ancient figures who have conditions like asthma, for example. So they sort of talk about how difficult it is to sort of have that condition. We don't really have that kind of material for amputees. Unfortunately, I mean, perhaps at one point we did, perhaps they did write down their experiences, but those just haven't survived. So there is one literary account of a man who, I mentioned this man earlier. He lost his right hand and then he replaced it with an iron hand, and he used that instead. And he was actually, his peers attempted to marginalize him and prevent him from performing sacrifices for public religious rites, presumably because they were worried that because he was using his other hand, he might drop something, he might sort of disrupt the ceremony, and they tried to exclude him, and he would not be excluded. He gave a big long speech in public about how he was a war hero and therefore he should be allowed to sacrifice. We don't have that speech. We have the sort of paraphrasing of someone else who 200 years later read that speech. And otherwise, if that writer hadn't made that reference, we would not have known that that man existed, and we would have not have known about his struggles. So yeah, we have very selective, very sort of sporadic evidence, and I mean it is something that very possibly people did experience, and if they were the right sort of person who went to the right sort of doctor who would write down their patient account. I mean, I can look for that. That would be quite interesting, because we do have sort of case histories of various different people, but it's not something that I've come across myself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the somatory sensory cortex hasn't changed in 2000 years, has it? So you're going to get those sensations being felt in the Greek and Roman period just as you do today. But again,
Well,
how
it's also the ancient doctors don't treat disability.
yeah.
Ancient doctors are very selective about what they treat, because that is how they make their money. How they make their reputation is by treating people successfully. And so they stay away from disability, they stay away from chronic illness, because if they try to treat it and they fail, they look stupid, they look incompetent, and that won't attract more patients.
Yeah.
So if somebody did experience some sort of phantom limb situation and they went to a doctor, the doctor would probably just say, well, what do you expect me to do about that, you know?
Yeah. So we're talking more about sort of woodworkers, metal workers are involved in this rather than physicians, right? So,
Yes, we do not have any doctors talking about prosthetics in the way that today you would see it as a medical service. What we see are references to the sort of the artisans and the craftspeople making these, rather than any doctors prescribing them.
Okay, so another question: do we have ancient examples of or forms of wheelchairs?
Well, that is something that people do debate, because while we do have evidence for walking frames, they seem to have been used by children. So although today elderly people quite often use Zimmer frames, we don't have any references to ancient Greeks and Romans using Zimmer frames. We just have references to children using walking frames. What we do have are, bearing in mind, the ancient world is both ancient Greece, ancient Rome, they had slaves. They had enslaved people who were doing all sorts of things. So for people who were physically impaired or physically immobile, paraplegics, for example, they would be carried around in chairs and on litters by people, by litter bearers. And so they weren't they didn't need to sort of transport themselves, wheel themselves. And this is another fundamental difference, actually, that's very interesting between ancient disability and contemporary disability, because if you have some sort of accident and you become impaired and disabled, a big part of your rehabilitation is relearning how to do everything so that you can be as independent as possible, because we have this sort of modern mentality of we must be an independent individual, we must not be a burden to anybody else, we must do as much as we can for ourselves. Whereas in antiquity, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in ancient Egypt, you have slaves. So the enslaved members of your household, they wash you, they dress you, they do your hair, they apply your cosmetics, they read your letters, they write your letters in reply, they take you places. So ancient people are not independent or individualized in the way that we are today. They, unless you were extremely poor, you would have had at least one or even several enslaved people in your household. So they would be doing a lot of the things that today would be quite challenging for a person with a disability. Whereas in antiquity, you're using your body in quite a different way, and you're never alone, you're never in private, you're never expected to do the amount of things that we are expected to do for ourselves today. So
Yeah, I mean,
wheelchairs are not something that would really feature in the kind of ancient mindset, because you can just sit in a chair and you can tell people where you want to go.
I mean, it's a big difference now, isn't it? That privacy was just a different thing then, so the idea that you would do everything as a group, which would be eating, defecating, fornicating, everything. This would be part of the group. There was none of that, uh, hiding it all away and doing it
No, and at the
separately.
same time, the enslaved people, they're furniture. So
Yeah.
you would be in a room surrounded by enslaved people, and you would consider yourself to be alone in a sense, because they're furniture, they're not people, they're your tools. But at the same time, yes, they would obviously be there. They would be listening to everything that was going on. They would be seeing everything that was going on.
Just to be clear, we're not advocating for the return of slavery. So just another question. Yeah, we've got an example of, do you have any examples of prosthetic hands that would articulate, would be able to hold objects? Or did they all tend to be sort of, fixed, or as we said before, a knife or whatever? Do we have something that you think would be a bit more functional and adaptable than that?
No, in the archaeological record, we have we have literary references to them: iron hand, gold hand, etc. But I think what those would likely have been are simply just things that look like hands. They wouldn't be articulated. They wouldn't be useful. We don't hear about hooks, funnily enough. I mean, there is the sort of the traditional idea of the sort of the hook hand, which would have been quite useful for sort of picking things up and stuff like that. But we don't hear about anybody having anything like that in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So I think, and this is another reason why potentially more people didn't use prosthetic devices, is because they weren't actually that useful. They weren't actually that functional. So if you wanted to have one that looked very good, that's one thing. But if you wanted to have one that would actually replace or restore the function of your lost hand, that's not going to happen. So I think it would have been a bit more like statuary, you know, it would have just been there, and it would have been stationary. But we don't have any in the archaeological record.
So just going back to the previous question, so again, if you could afford them, you might have a slave who would do some of your functions for you. You might be able to get something prosthetic. What do you do if you are a slave, or what happens to a slave who becomes physically impaired?
It very much depends on the type of impairment and the type of household that they're in. So the very wealthy, from the king or the emperor downwards into the sort of the wealthy elite, they actually very much like having enslaved people with certain types of impairments in their households. So they like spinal curvature, they like dwarfism, they like things like that they can show off to their friends. There are even references to people who didn't have arms or legs, and so they had to do things like string a bow with their toes, or sort of hold things with their toes rather than their hands. And so these are amazing, astounding tricks that you can get a kick out of watching. So those are cool and fun and interesting things to have in your household. And so for some people with certain conditions, they would actually be quite prized and quite in demand, and it would be quite a lucrative life, quite a cushy life, and horrible because you are enslaved and you have no sort of personal autonomy and no bodily autonomy. If your master or your mistress wants to strip you naked and show you off at a party, you can't say no to that. But compared to the kind of lives that other enslaved people were living, it's obviously better than that. But if you became, say you as you aged, you lost your sight or something like that, that's a different matter, because that is something that your master or your mistress may or may not be willing to accommodate. So there is one example of one wealthy Roman whose wife had a clown, so some sort of entertainer, who was going blind, and they were still looking after her. They had her in a nice room, and they were taking care of her, because there was this bond between his wife and her retainer. But at the same time, we get references to people abandoning their ill or elderly or impaired slaves at healing sanctuaries, or very, very mercenary masters simply being told to sell their slaves who were no longer able to do the things that they had originally been purchased to do. And you could, if you bought a slave at a slave market, and they were later found to have some kind of specific disability that stopped them from doing the thing that you had hired them to do, you could take them back. You could legally get your money back. So it is really not. It's the experience was not universal. There were sort of there were very different sort of situations and outcomes for enslaved people who had impairments and disabilities.
Yeah. So we have at least moved on a little bit. So yeah, so fascinating talk. I think we're going to bring it to a close now. So I want to say a big thank you to Jane Draycott for fielding all of my questions, all of the audience's questions over the last hour. Thank you to those of you listening in. Thank you to those who put questions. Sorry I couldn't ask them all. We did get a flurry of questions at the end. But I'm sure Jane would be happy to answer any questions you wish to put to her. So again, thanks to all. Thanks to the organisers this evening. Thanks to everybody who came to attend and for listening. And thanks particularly to Jane. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.